how is your mum with 4 kids meant to keep an eye on all of you? Well, you just pop a leash on.
Eavesdroppin.
Hello, Michelle.
Hello, Geordie. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Well, I've been better. I think I've got a summer cold or some such. I don't bloody know, but
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, it's playing. So apologies if I sound like a bit rubbish today. Just not 100%, but I'm going to give it 100%. So
you reach deep inside yourself and you just pull it out of the bag, Michelle, every time. You're a consummate professional.
Thanks for saying that. But I mean, maybe we should just take a moment to talk to our listeners about what we are professionals about, because we're eavesdroppers.
You are eavesdropping on mine and Michelle's conversation. Each week we have a conversation on this very platform. It's a podcast. You listen to it. Sometimes you can watch it because there is a YouTube channel. Michelle will tell you more about that later. And we also have a Patreon page, which is where you can, if you enjoy these conversations, you can go onto that. You can have access to our merchandise, which is not up there yet, but it's on its way, and a few extra droppings. We used to do free extra droppings, but now you have to pay. So to do that, you either pay a little bit of money each week or month or whatever, or you give us a tip. And you get access to things. It's great, isn't it, Michelle?
It is great. And you know, it's nice to support us, but there is actually another way you can support us, because if you have not voted for us yet in the British Podcast Awards Listener's Choice, you can do so. And I will be putting a link or something. That's what you like to do, isn't it? I'll put a link. Oh, I'll link to that. I'll put a link in the show notes. I know. I actually don't know that anyone even looks at the bloody show notes, but they're a gem of information. They're a resource wealth. But anyway, but it is BritishPodcastAwards.com/vote. Then you put in Eavesdroppin, no G apostrophe, and you'll find us. You'll see our little faces, and then you just give us a vote.
Silly little faces.
Yeah.
Thank you. We really need your support, because with that Listener's Choice Award, it could help us to reach many more eavesdroppers and help us to do this more full time, which means that the quality would be improved and the quantity would be improved. And then you'd have a better time listening to us jibber-jabbering about things like supernatural, true crime, real life, ghosty-woasties, UFOs, poisonings, all sorts. Why did I say poisonings, Michelle?
I don't know.
How odd.
That is odd. I wonder what's on your mind these days. But you know what?
Something's on my mind.
Well, something's on my mind. It is last week's episode. Now, you talked about Gator Rogowski, who is a former professional skateboarder who was convicted of raping and murdering a woman 30 years ago. Now, we did talk about how he was sentenced to 31 years to life in jail back in 1991 because he killed Jessica Bergston. Well, you had said in the episode that, you know, he kept coming up for parole, kept getting it denied. Yeah. Well, in the last 2 weeks, he's been paroled. He has actually been
He's out.
Paroled. Well, no. He was granted parole at the beginning of the month by the State Board of Parole Hearings. Then San Diego County District Attorney's Office said that Jessica Bergston's family members were devastated, and they've got 1 month to appeal the decision to reverse it and have him not out. So his parole, as much as I understand it, has been approved, but there is 1 month to have the decision reversed. So
right, so he's still sitting pretty in prison, and they're just waiting to dot the I's and cross the T's or whatever, and then he's either free or not.
Yeah, and I think they've got 1 more week.
How long has he done?
I think 31 years. I'll give you an update on that once we figure it out. But how interesting that we did not even sort of realise that he was like back in the headlines.
Well, yeah, exactly. The only reason why I chose that story, Michelle, was because I had been listening, as I mentioned last week, to Heidi World, which is a documentary-style podcast on the rise and fall of Heidi Fleiss back in the 90s, young Hollywood madam. She was only about 22 or something when she became a top Hollywood madam through various means. That story came up because Gator's girlfriend, high-profile girlfriend at the time, Brandy McLean, was a Heidi girl.
Yeah.
So that story came up and I looked deeper into it. And of course, it had links back to Canberra because of my days as a Canberra skate Betty. And a lot of my friends who were also skaters at the time, I did reach out. I only got a small bit of information back from one of our friends who shall remain nameless. When Gator Rogowski was arrested, there was a friend of his who is a pro skateboarder now who found it really, really tough because it was obvious at the time that Gator was mentally ill. And it could have been the head injuries because do you remember he fell out of a window or was pushed out of a window while he was on tour in Germany? And I don't know if you know this, but there's a documentary about Michael Hutchence. He had a head injury when he had an altercation with a Danish cab driver when he was dating Helena Christensen, and he ended up in hospital. I think he was in a coma briefly. His whole personality changed after that. He ended up on drugs, and of course, we know what happened to Michael Hutchence in the end. What my source was saying was that Gator was definitely a narcissistic and had delusions of grandeur at the time, probably because of the amount of money and fame that were heaped upon him at the time. And it was just the tip of the iceberg of the pro skate world of the 80s and 90s. It was plagued with mental illnesses, death by misadventure, suicide, long jail stints. All these young men whose lives were marked from a hedonistic lifestyle and all of this money and everything and adulation from a sport that was once underground and outlawed to a now clean, corporate, bland, jock-filled, very sterile sport indeed. You wouldn't recognize it as it is today compared to the 80s and 90s or 70s, 80s and 90s skateboarding world. It used to be exciting.
And then, like everything, it gets monetized. And corporatized. I mean, look, there's nothing wrong with monetizing a sport because, people have to live, and it's a little bit like podcasting, if you want people to be able to do it. I was just going to say, it's a bit like
monetizing a podcast. Exactly.
It is. If you want people to be able to do this full time, you have to make some money out of it.
Yeah.
I managed to find, and it is in the show notes, you talked a little bit last week about a documentary called Stoked, The Rise and Fall of Gator. I've found the link to the whole documentary on YouTube. And I've put that in the show notes. And I started watching it, and I've got to go back and finish it because it's so interesting. And reading the comments underneath, people having first-hand accounts of meeting Gator and how they felt about the skateboarding world at that time. It's super interesting. So I'll put that link again in this week's show notes. It was a real shock to the skating world because apparently he was so revered for his style and for his easy charm, but there could be something in what you say about this head injury, and his personality just changed because my dad suffered a head injury. He was working on the Snowy Mountain scheme when he first came to Australia as a migrant. He was down the mines. That's where they put all the migrant workers, down the mines.
God.
There was a thing called a jumbo, which is where you put a ledge into the rock so you can keep chipping away at the rock to build tunnels underground. It fell and my dad suffered a head injury.
Oh, God.
And Jen has a theory that Dad was never the same after that. I mean, these are all just anecdotal things. Yeah, head injuries are serious, and often the effects of them are not seen until years, possibly decades later.
That's really interesting, Michelle. There's so much we could talk about head injuries. Absolutely. Like a lot of serial killers, you can trace back to the moment where they suffered a head injury as a child or whatever. But I have something from another eavesdropper this week. If you're an eavesdropper and you write in, you get your name read out, just like Rains Park Mark. Hello, Rains Park Mark. We love you, Mark. He's an avid listener. He has voted also for us in the listener's choice. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that, and so does Michelle.
Oh, and actually, I just want to say on that topic, thank you to everyone on the Facebook pages and, on our personal and on the Eavesdroppin Facebook page who have said done. When we put a link to the voting, they've all gone, done. We've given
Beautiful.
you a big love heart. We're so grateful. So thank you so much.
Beyond grateful. But meanwhile, going back to Rains Park Mark, who is an eavesdropper and is a supportive one at that, he sent us a story, Michelle, that he discovered from Vice magazine. Vice is brilliant for all these kind of underground stories that people don't really hear about. It was quite heartbreaking, actually, so brace yourself. It was about a South African town called East London, and it only happened on the 27th of June, so this is only last week in our timeline currently. 22 teenagers were found dead in a club in this South African town. The investigation has been launched, but currently authorities have no idea how the victims, who are aged between 13 and 17, how they died. They were found in a place called the Enyobeni Tavern at 4:30 a.m., and it appears that they were all celebrating at the time, possibly the end of school. There were no visible wounds. The bodies were all laying across the tavern like they had dropped in the middle of conversations or dancing. And there's a few theories that they may have been poisoned, harking back to my comment about poisoning at the top of the show.
Uh-huh.
That's what was on my mind. Other theories were of a stampede to get into the crowded building, but there are no visible signs of injury. There are survivors, and one of them actually spoke to the BBC. She said that she escaped through the window after her friends began to collapse. How odd. I haven't been able to find anything more about it.
That's really strange because I actually was just rifling through the internet. I say rifling like I'm going through like an old school
Scanning.
Rolodex or something. Yeah, I was on the internet as you are. Oh my God. What is wrong with me today? On the internet.
You're not well.
I'm not well. Brain's not engaged. But there are all these mysterious deaths, cancers and poisonings and things all over the world right now. Yeah, there's a school in America where there are something like 80 students who have this extremely rare form of brain cancer.
In the same school?
Yep.
That's bizarre.
Yeah, there is a lot. I'll put some links in the show notes. But yeah, there's a real spate of these mysterious illnesses. But obviously, these poor people died. So you've not been able to find anything more?
Nothing more, no.
In the coming weeks, there might be some more information on what happened to these kids.
Well, stay tuned. Extra, read all about it.
Give me the scoop.
Eavesdropping wins and there's no doubt about it.
Eavesdropping.
This week's theme is Mysterious Mysteries, Michelle. If you remember, I said to you, let's do Mysterious Mysteries.
I know, and I didn't do it. I'm sorry. I've got something completely different, but you'll love it anyway. Sorry about that.
So my Mysterious Mysteries, Michelle, were prompted by a program that I found called Missing 411. It's very sad.
Yeah, I am.
It was about a 2-year-old boy called Deorr Kunz Jnr. who disappeared on July 10th, 2015 in Salmon Chalice National Park in Idaho on a camping trip with his family in remote, rocky, mountainous terrain. The campsite wasn't more than a clearing by a creek, so it was proper wild camping, and it was in the dead end down a 17-mile unmade track. In this documentary, Michelle, there were so many beautiful places, wild, remote, mountainous, in the middle of America. It's incredible, it's huge, and it was about people going missing because there's a lot of people that go missing. In fact, we have spoken in the last weeks, just because it's been to do with our stories, about people going missing. A lot of the time in America, sometimes elsewhere, like you had South America recently. And it's just horrifying how many people do go missing. So poor old Deorr and his parents, Deorr Sr. and Mum Jessica, went on this trip, this camping trip, really remote. And when you say going to a campsite, it's not like what you do here in England where you book in, you go down to Dorset, you're cheek by jowl in a bell tent with lots of other people, East Dulwich by sea, doggies, families, waking up at the crack of dawn by babies crying. There is no one else here with Deorr and his family. It is in the middle of nowhere. Like I said, at the end of a track. They're with Jessica's granddad, Bob, and Bob's close friend, Isaac, who is a last-minute addition. Now, day one, Deorr and his parents went to the store to get some groceries and things. And on their way back, they found Granddad Bob and Isaac had been fishing and they'd caught a few little minnows and things, which fascinated little Deorr. The whole family were keen fishermen and they were keen to get started. Deorr's parents, Jessica and Deorr Sr., asked the older men to show them where they had cast in. So they walked down the creek a little way and had a look at the spot because they were getting loads of fish. Now, Granddad was quite old and he was on oxygen. So he wandered back to the campsite and little Deorr decided to go with him. So it was kind of acknowledged between the parents and Granddad Bob that they'd keep an eye on Deorr. Off he went. So Granddad went and sat down in his chair, which was between his RV or truck or trailer that he was sleeping in. They were sleeping in their vehicles. And he saw Deorr playing by a bush, like a gorse bush or something. And then the next thing you know, he vanished in thin air. I mean, obviously, Granddad blinked or looked away or something. But Deorr had only been 50 yards away and it had only been 10 minutes. And then he was gone. So he called out. The family had joined him. They were all looking everywhere, calling, yelling, searching everywhere. They couldn't get signal on their phone. Dad drives off a little way to try and get some signal. Meanwhile, Mum gets through. Poor old Granddad Bob, though, he's quite elderly and does have a few memory issues. So who knows whether or not more time had passed. But I think it was a very short period of time when they did raise the alarm. Isaac, who was his friend, was actually a younger man who had befriended Granddad Bob in their neighbourhood. And witnesses say that Isaac never really searched for the boy, and he did have previous sex crime misdemeanors on his rap sheet. It was a bit of an odd bod, and the parents had never met him before. But suffice to say, because of the remoteness of the place, they would have known if anyone else had been there and abducted Deorr, and everyone present at the campsite became suspects.
This is sounding really creepy already.
It's creepy. It's awful. He's 2 years old.
And do you know what? Shades of Azaria Chamberlain, I keep thinking remote spot, child goes missing.
How the fuck does a baby go missing? Exactly. So it's usually an animal. And in Azaria's case, it was an animal. But that was after that poor family went through hell and her mother went to prison as well.
Yep.
Now, Deorr's family equally had to deal with hundreds of Facebook pages about Deorr because he's never been found, Michelle. Spoiler, he's never been found. That was in 2015. They've never found a single trace of this little boy. So the family, they're being blamed. They're being called white trash. There's stories accusing them of selling the little boy to pay off their debts, that he never even made it to the campsite, all sorts of things. They employed a private investigator who eventually withdrew from the case because he felt the parents weren't being truthful and he didn't understand why they wouldn't advertise nationally the $20,000 reward that they had put up. Who knows what their reasons were. But suffice to say, Michelle, as you've just touched on with Azaria Chamberlain, and Australia is equally a massive country with a lot of unnavigated terrain. Every year in America, hundreds of people vanish from these remote parks, and little Deorr's disappearance was eerily similar to another in the Rocky Mountains National Park in August 1958.
Oh, you think about all of these national parks, and like you say, uncharted terrain.
They're huge.
I always say, if there was a way to figure out how many bodies are buried out in the desert in Australia, there's got to be loads, because it's an easy way to like abduct and hide bodies, because no one's ever going to find those bodies.
No.
And do you remember in the Stranger Things episode, I talked about hundreds of thousands of people go missing every year in America. They're not all in remote places, but people just go missing. It's terrifying.
Yeah, and there's never any trace of them to be found. Bobby Bizup in 1958, he was aged 10. He went missing while at a camp for boys in a place called St. Malo in the Rocky Mountains. Bobby was partially deaf and he was fishing when a camp counselor came to tell him it was dinner time. So Bobby gathered up his things and followed the camp counselor as he walked away. But after a few yards, the counselor turned around to look and Bobby was gone, only after a few yards. So, of course, there was a search which was immediately set off, which included bloodhounds, 400 volunteers. It completely confounded the authorities as to how he could have vanished so quickly. Yes, he was partially deaf, so he may not have heard people calling for him. But after 9 days and no sign of any of Bobby's belongings or remains, they stopped the search. 3 of the camp counsellors who searched for Bobby that year returned the next year. And while searching 2,000 feet above a mountain that was above called Mount Beaker, which had been searched with a fine-tooth comb the year Bobby went missing, they found his remains in a ravine.
What?
Again, that ravine had already been thoroughly searched. So what the fuck?
He was snatched and taken whether it was by a human or an animal, he was snatched and...
Or...
aliens! Do you know what? It did cross my mind. I didn't want to say it.
I knew it would.
Because I thought, oh, God, it's my go-to for everything.
Well, this documentary was leaning heavily.
No.
It was trying to piece together all these disappearances, and it was saying that a lot of the children who went missing in particular were either very young, or Bobby was partially deaf, or another boy that had autism or learning difficulties. But that also could go a ways to explaining how they wouldn't hear people calling for them or other things. I think what the documentary filmmaker wanted to say was that it was Bigfoot, to be honest with you.
It could be Bigfoot. Who knows?
Yeah.
But there have been enough reports of something out there by so many people that we can't discount that aliens could exist. They are, generally benign towards us. So this is quite aggressive.
So why are they taking kids and then dropping them off a year later? Yeah.
And then just dumping them on the top of a mountain in a ravine so their remains can be found. I mean, why bother doing that? Just never put the remains back anywhere.
But anyway, during the search for Deorr, for example, his grandmother detailed how they really did look so hard. They were told to take 5 steps. These are hundreds of people. Take 5 steps. Look up, look down, look around. Take 5 steps. Look up, look down, look around. That's how they were searching. The creek nearby was searched by people on their hands and knees until it got too deep, clearly. And they checked inside eagles' nests as well, because a little boy, he's only small, he could have been taken by a wild animal or a bird, which is probably the likeliest reason, I would say. But the family feel that there should have been a boot or an item of clothing that would have come loose and been found, like his shoes weren't really on very tight and things like that.
Snatched.
Could be, but they were in the middle of nowhere. That road was 17 miles long to get there. They would have heard another car arrive. That's what they're saying.
Yeah, it's a mysterious mystery.
Mysterious mysteries. On the 2nd of October in 1999, 3-year-old Jaryd Atadero disappeared in the Comanche Peak wilderness. Now, Jaryd lived there with his dad, who was a shopkeeper called Alan, and his sister Jocelyn, who was 6, at a resort. They were the shopkeepers of this resort. It's astonishingly beautiful, Michelle. Absolutely gorgeous. 10 acres of wilderness-style camping. And on the day of his disappearance, a Christian singles group who was staying at the lodge and working for Alan in return for lodging decided to visit a trout farm, and Jocelyn wanted to go with them. So, of course, she was allowed to go, but then, of course, little Jaryd also wanted to go. Now, Dad's a single working father, and he trusted the group, and he knew them well enough to allow his children to join the trek, guaranteeing that somebody would always keep an eye on the children. So this group drove 15 miles up the road, and the trail was kind of moderate, and little Jaryd still needed to be watched by an adult, which he was, but the group spread out and separated, and the one woman that was responsible for the children was kind of ahead of the rest of the group. Then she lost sight of little Jaryd for about 20 minutes. So she raced up the mountain looking for him. 20 minutes is a long time, lady. You should have been looking harder.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm judging. I shouldn't be. But apparently during this time, Jaryd had come across some fishermen who he did actually speak to. But that was it. Then he was gone. And no one saw hide nor hair of him since. The group members returned to tell Alan what happened to Jaryd. So he jumps in his car and he races up there. He's looking, he's screaming, he's calling for his boy. 65 search and rescue volunteers worked for a seriously long time searching for Jaryd, day and night, with no sign of the boy or his belongings at all, until 3.5 years later, Michelle. These walkers, or hikers if you'd like to call them, Rob Osborne and Gareth Watts, who were hiking the Big South Trail in June 2003. They arrived at the Rocky Mountains and walked up 2,000 feet, where they spotted a pristine shoe, so well kept that they thought it must belong to somebody who was nearby. They realized that the little boy had gone missing before, and they also thought it was way too high for a 3-year-old to climb, and it was extremely rough terrain. But eventually they did happen upon Jaryd's clothing, the cap of his skull, and one tooth sitting on top of a log.
What? No.
So that was his remains, and that's all that remained of Jaryd, sadly.
Do you remember when we were talking about the girls in Panama who went missing?
Yeah.
The backpack had been found pristine. It had been supposedly, should have been out in torrential rains. Same with this shoe. How is it pristine after 3.5 years being in the outdoors? Something strange. And placed on a log? Very odd. Now, I want to go back to these fishermen. Were they ever investigated? Were they ever found?
That's all I've got. They would have been investigated. They would have been spoken to about it. But during the initial search for Jaryd, the sniffer dogs had actually alerted to the top of the hill. So it would have been searched, despite it being so much higher than a little boy could have reached and mountainous and rocky. So what do you think it is? Is it an animal encounter? Is it a caring Bigfoot who then takes them in and looks after them for 3.5 years and then they die accidentally? And then, I don't know. I don't know. It's just so weird. There was no animal DNA left on Jaryd's clothing. There was no blood. The jacket and shoes were in good condition considering they'd been out there for 3.5 years. There was no scuffs on his trainers to indicate that he'd been dragged by an animal. And his trousers were found inside out. So that's not the work of a mountain lion.
No, that's the work of a human. That's not nice, is it?
But there was no DNA. Well, obviously they didn't find a body, but the clothing was fine.
Aliens. I mean, it's... no, I'm joking.
It's aliens.
It's always aliens. But what happened to our nice aliens, you know?
Well, maybe they're out there taking bits and bobs.
Do you know what? Just like humans... Maybe there are evil aliens.
Maybe.
Not nice.
But let's look beyond the aliens for a moment there, Michelle, because since all this has happened, there's been a campaign for a database to be set up to record how many people go missing. And you said earlier how many. There's hundreds of thousands who go missing from wilderness areas and national parks, and what was involved in the searches, the success rate, so it can all be assessed for future cases. But when the documentary makers requested a list of the missing people from all these parks and wildernesses in the US and Canada, they were told that such a list would cost $1.4 million.
Do you know what? Fucking spend it, because they spend more than that on dumb shit. So
yes,
I actually really feel like there needs to be a map. And what I mean by that is like a database map, and everyone can have it in the United States. And this map plots out where all of these disappearances have happened across the entire country. So at a glance, you can see, okay, since, in the last 50 years, there have been 87 disappearances in this area. And then you can see if there are any links, patterns, but it's got to be done. And really, 1.4 million? That's child's play. That's nothing. No, but really, take that off the defense budget, they wouldn't even notice.
Yeah, you're right. I scrolled through the National Park Service investigative services, and it makes for troubling reading, Michelle. You've got the number one at the top of this huge list was a Jane Doe who turned out to be one of serial killer Henry Lee Lucas's victims, right down to men in their 70s who went on hikes never to return with only their backpacks as any evidence being found years later. And of course, all those children that were in the documentary were catalogued in there as well. Thousands. Absolutely thousands. And it's hard to believe in this day of CCTV and drones that people can just vanish without trace. Yosemite seems to be a particular black hole where there's tons of people going missing there.
Well, I told you about Charlie Haub, who went missing right here in Zermatt. There was the CCTV footage of him with his backpack going through the turnstiles out into the mountains because he'd taken the gondola up to the top of Klein Mountain and never seen again. This guy was the heir to a billion fortune in Germany. So
that's clearly fishy.
It's fishy. When we did talk about some theories there involving Russia, like you say, in this day and age, how do people just go missing?
I've got this final comment from a Reddit user called Hector Abaya. And that person wrote about how the wilderness can affect your senses. And they said, quite often people are calling, they should be within shouting distance because of the time that's elapsed. But for some reason, they're not hearing anything. And this person believes that sound in the wilderness is weird. They go on to say, I've spent a ton of time hiding from searchers as a training subject in the wilderness, I think they're saying. And even I'm still sometimes surprised at how variable sound can be. I've had searchers shouting for me from maybe 50 feet away who I couldn't hear because of a slight ridge and wind blowing away from me. On the other hand, I've been freaked out by hearing a dog panting and human voices just above me when I knew the team weren't close to me yet because I was hiding on the edge of a canyon and there was a weird magnifying echo effect. Usually the trend is for sound to be dampened though. Even a bit of vegetation, a small hill and a slight breeze you barely notice are enough to muffle sound to a surprising degree. So it could just be very much like Picnic at Hanging Rock. The elements are working against you.
I would agree with that because I have hiked a lot here in the Swiss Alps. It can freak you out about sound and where it's coming from. And you think something is really close. It's not at all. And other things you can't sort of hear. And it really depends on where you are. And especially with the glacier here, you know, the sound does very strange things on snow, on ice, on rock. So I think there is something in what that guy's saying for sure.
Yeah. So that's my mysterious mysteries for you there.
Like you said before, what's the upshot to all of this? Animals, aliens, devious humans.
No one knows, and that's why there needs to be a database.
Yeah, or like I said, like a kind of a disappearance map. So all of these disappearances are joined up.
Don't go to Yosemite. Don't go to the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah, Jesus.
Don't take your children on hikes.
Or if you do,
that you can't do that, can you? That's just living through fear. You mustn't do that.
But if you do, you could do what I think Jen had in the 80s or 70s.
A leash.
A leash. Yes.
We were all on leashes
like
back
a dog
then,
leash
weren't we?
for kids. How is your mum with 4 kids meant to keep an eye on all of you? Well, you just pop a leash on. Honestly, they're going to have a resurgence. Going to make a comeback.
I can just see Jen walking down Canberra High Street with 4 kids like a team of huskies pulling her down the street.
Yeah, she just needed a sledge. That's all. Then we'd be off. You got the vibes.
I got the vibes.
You got the vibes.
I got the vibes.
Now, I think I must have missed the memo from you, Geordie, on mysterious mysteries because I thought it was sort of mysterious deaths or something.
Yeah, well, mysterious. Anything mysterious, I suppose.
Well, the thing is that it started off that I was, searching for mysterious deaths. And this thing did come up, which then just turned into something completely different. So, yeah, apologies in advance for that because I did come across a guy called Warren Jeffs. Honestly, I don't know how we've not come across this guy before because it is culty, it is creepy, and it's, right up our street. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about it because I think probably maybe you have come across this guy and maybe...
I have. I've been told by a couple of eavesdroppers, Yannicka being one of them, because there's a documentary out at the moment, Keep Sweet and Pray or Obey.
Pray and Obey, yeah. So that's where it led me to.
Did you watch it?
No, I didn't because I didn't know about the documentary. I found him completely through mysterious deaths because there's a woman. I'll get to why it's come up under like mysterious death searches. But I'll just circle back to a little bit about why Warren Jeffs is all over the press at the moment. So in Utah, since 1929, there's been a radical Mormon cult called the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's too much of a mouthful to say, so I'm just going to abbreviate it to FLDS. Look, it seems like it was just an extreme offshoot of the Church of Latter-day Saints, which is basically your bog standard Mormon kind of sect.
Polygamy.
Yes, but yeah, FLDS did believe in polygamy and some other crazy left field stuff. So in 2002, when the church's spiritual leader, who was called Roland Jeffs, died at the age of 92, his son Warren Jeffs took over the congregation. And the spiritual leader of the FLDS church is considered a prophet of God and is the only person able to perform marriages within the group. And he can also punish followers by reassigning their wives, their children and property to other people.
Christ.
So it's
That's
like,
awful.
if you get on the wrong side of this guy, he's like, right, I'm taking your wife, your kids and everything you own. I'm going to give it to some other dude.
Wow.
It's a lot of power. And Warren essentially became the group's prophet of God.
Well, he's the son of
Rulon Jeffs. Yeah, he's the son because Rulon died, son took over. And when he did, that's when things began to get weirder than usual. So what led me to Warren Jeffs is I read an article where Warren's 65th wife, Brielle Decker, her name is, and apparently he had 87 wives.
Oh, man.
So she's come out in the past few months to say that there were so many mysterious deaths and suicides within the congregation after Warren took over that it seemed like she was going to a funeral every week. So what the hell was going on?
Oh, my goodness.
And I read that Rulon and Warren were both into this controversial kind of Mormon doctrine called blood atonement.
I don't like it.
No, of course you don't like it. It's horrible. And that's where they believe that the crucifixion of Jesus Christ did not cleanse people of all of their sins. So anyone who sins beyond the cleansing power of Jesus Christ, and this included crimes like murder, but also things like adultery, or I think even talking to a man in a way that was suggestive, who, if you were married, was, considered like on the way to adultery. Well, they had to atone for their sins by having their blood spilled. So Brielle, she fled this cult/church in 2013 after years of abuse. And she has said in reports that there were so many deaths and they were all told that they were accidents every time. So you never really knew what was an accident and what wasn't. And she said that she thinks some of the deaths were staged to look like accidents. And she relates this all back to this blood atonement. So there's not a lot on the internet about whether or not these mysterious deaths were accidents or if it was the church basically just killing their own and making it look like accidents, because this church has come under fire, particularly Warren Jeffs, for all sorts of other horrible things. But I just want to talk a little bit about Brielle, because we've already said that it was polygamy. She says she was just 18 when she was forced to marry Warren Jeffs. And I have to say, after looking into this cult, 18 is kind of old, because this guy, and trigger warning, and this is not going to come as any surprise to anyone who...
He liked them young, I'm sure.
He did like them young. So she was 18 at the time. He was 50. And in all the newspaper reports, look, they show this picture, and it's this really creepy photo of not all 87 wives, just some of the wives. And they're all in these identical dresses, but they're all in different coloured pastel colours, right?
Like an ice cream shop.
Do you remember in the 80s, all pastel colours were all the rage? You would have your...
Yes.
It was beautiful, but it's like gelato colours. And she's in there looking young and gorgeous, but they all have these creepy, weird, like high neck dresses on. And obviously Warren Jeffs was in the middle, like with his harem of women. And
yuck.
It's not nice. You just look at that and you just know something weird's going on here. And she says she was groomed basically her whole life to marry Warren. And that when she was 18, she had this secret arranged marriage, which took place in a secret location because Warren Jeffs was on the run from the police. And
what, for polygamy?
Well, I knew you were going to ask. So big trigger warning here.
Oh, God.
Sexual abuse, right?
Oh, what a monster.
Really. And sexual abuse against children.
Yeah.
So, and he'd been doing it for years. And
what a nasty piece of work.
But look, spoiler alert, he is currently in prison for sexual abuse charges.
Okay.
I want to park that horrific part of the cult and go back to Brielle. She said she was terrified of marrying him because she says the church was set up like a pyramid with him at the top. And he'd set up his family in the same way with his favourite wives near the top. Mm-hmm. And look, I'll just remind you here again, this church/cult was in Utah. And you know what else started in Utah?
The home of MLMs.
MLMs?
The home of MLMs.
Exactly. So we've got pyramid schemes.
Multi-level marketing.
Exactly.
Ponzi schemes.
Yep. doTERRA.
Pyramid schemes.
Yep.
doTERRA.
LuLaRoe, Arbonne. All of those.
They've all started in Utah.
They did. And if you want to know more about MLMs, you can listen to our episode from season 2, episode 46. And I will put...
Someone's done their research.
I have, because I was just thinking, my God, everything we talk about on this podcast, it's all in this bloody story, you know, because there's shades of Keith Raniere right here as well, you know.
Yes, absolutely. It smacks of him.
You know, sex cult, which I know we don't want to go into that because it's too creepy with this whole FLDS. But, you know, sex cult, Keith Raniere, MLMs, you know, like we had talked about, doTERRA, everything just sort of feeds into this stuff. Utah, which has so much beautiful wilderness. I'm sure kids are going missing there as well if you had your wilderness map. So back to Keith Raniere, we did do an episode on the NXIVM cult and the whole shebang in season 2, episode 8. And again, I'll put some links in the show notes. Back to Brielle. She says that at the FLDS church cult, women were taught to be obedient and subservient to their husbands. And they were forced to wear these heavy pastel dresses that I talked about, buttoned up to the neck. And they were also taught to obey their husband's whims.
Right. Keep sweet, obey and pray.
Yep. And actually, when I read that, it just did make me think of The Handmaid's Tale, where they were all made to wear matching dresses and all the women were taught to obey the men. So Handmaid's Tale, work of fiction, but is it? Because it's happening. Yeah. You know, it's so creepy. So anyway, you can't talk about this cult without getting a little bit creepy, because she also said that underage girls were forced into marriages with much older men in the congregation, and that they were having kids before they were even legally considered adults themselves. You know, she says when she was 13, she watched her older sister, Colleen, marry the then cult leader, Warren's dad, Rulon Jeffs, who was in his late 80s. It's just, it's just so fucked up. And all because it was part of the church kind of gospel that the more wives and children a man has, the closer he is to God. And therefore, the greater his chances of salvation after death. And honestly, this dude, Warren Jeffs, is going to need a lot of salvation, because he was not a good guy. And look, I don't want to get too dark, but trigger warning, because like you had said earlier, he did like them young. And apparently he was the headmaster of this FLDS kind of school called the Alta Academy, because Brielle and hundreds, like basically all the other FLDS kids, they were forced to go to this school. They weren't allowed to go to normal school, where they had to learn all about the church's teachings. And he was headmaster. Before he was the leader of FLDS, he was headmaster of this school.
Right, okay.
And he was accused of doing all sorts of nasty things to the kids and sexual things, also to his own kids. So it's just not nice. And he would say that it was God's will, right? And this is part of what he was on the run from the police. If you remember, we said he was on the run from the police when Brielle got married to him. Part of it was there was a lawsuit against him brought against him by his nephew for not very nice things. And if you actually want to know more about that, this guy, his name's Brent, he wrote a book about it called Lost Boy, where he goes into all the details of what happened to him from Warren and other family members. Unbelievably, all of this child sexual abuse allegations, they were not actually what Warren Jeffs was wanted primarily by the police for when he married Brielle. Turns out Warren was never charged for those incidents when he was a headmaster. And
they closed ranks.
Well, turns out that these horrific acts only came to light because they formed part of a court testimony against him in 2011 at his trial, because he was on the run after being accused of arranging the marriage of a 14-year-old girl called Alyssa Wall to an older guy, and that it was there's a word for it, but it's basically like he was arranging what was in effect the rape of this girl because she was underage, pretty much. And look, that's why he was on the run, because that was the charge that was leveled against him. When he was busted by the police, it was because when he was on the run, he was driving a car with fake plates. And, it turns out he was wearing disguises. He had fake identity documents. So he knew he was on borrowed time. This whole thing just gets more and more bizarre because they knew they had a lot on this guy, but they couldn't pin anything on him because he was on the run. There were wanted posters put up all over Utah, 10 grand for info that led to his arrest and conviction. And that was in 2005. Then in April 2006, an arrest warrant was issued in Utah for Warren for felony charges. It's called accomplice rape. So this is where basically he's set up the marriages for these girls. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what he was on, even though there had been so much against him for the horrible things he'd done. He was up for this accomplice rape charge. And then in May that same year, 2006, the FBI put him on the most wanted fugitives list. He was actually in the top 10, and there was a $60,000 reward. But he still managed to evade police. And then during this time, somehow he did manage to go to Colorado City to marry 2 more child brides. Oh. One of them was Brielle. So then in August in 2000...
So it was a double marriage.
Yeah, because he's a polygamist. He's marrying as many as he can because he needs this salvation. And then in August 2006, his car was pulled over, like I said, fake plates, and, they found computers and mobile phones and wigs and sunglasses and loads of cash.
What's he up to?
Well, he's trying to disguise himself. And
I see. For himself. Right. Yes, of course. I didn't think of that.
Yeah, and he was thrown in jail, and basically he was charged in Arizona on 8 counts.
Trigger warning. Trigger warning. Trigger warning.
Including, and this is trigger warning, sexual misconduct with a minor and incest. So just gross. So his trial began in September 2007 in Utah, and after 3 weeks he was found guilty on 2 counts of being an accomplice to rape. And he was sentenced to prison for 10 years to life. And he started his sentence. I think he actually did 3 years of it. But then in 2010, the Utah Supreme Court overturned the conviction, and they said, listen, the jury was dodgy and they ordered a new trial. However, that never happened because he then was tried in Arizona on like more serious charges.
Okay, good.
Then on August 9 in 2011, he was convicted in Texas on 2 counts of sexual assault of a child and sentenced to life in prison. Where, that's where he is now, and he'll be eligible for parole in July 2038. So, he'll be an old man then, and they probably won't let him out, I imagine. And look, as we've hinted at, there is so much more we could go into detail about this case because it's really fucked up. So I'm going to, again, circle back to Brielle because she says that at 18, their marriage was never consummated because she thinks he...
Thank God?
Yes, thank God. But she said she was too old for him. He just needed more wives to like boost his...
He was just stacking them up.
And that, you know, she was made to do other things, though, which were quite gross. And that she witnessed a lot of coercive control that he had over the other wives. And there was this thing called the Law of Sarah, where he created this law where the wives had to like have sex with each other while he watched because he wanted the wives to become closer. It's so fucked up. That was when Brielle knew she had to get out. But it was really hard for her to get out of this cult because every move was being watched. And she says she thinks he knew she was trying to get out because at the age of 23, he sent, she says, cult doctors to drug her. And these are her words. She said, I didn't have an interview with a real doctor, just some nurses that showed up and gave me the medicine and told me to take it. And they watched her take it. So she had no choice. She had to have it. And she later found out that the drug she was given was called Seroquel, which is a prescription medication used to treat schizophrenia, which she was told would just help her sleep and calm down her anxiety. She didn't have anxiety. But she said initially the dose was fine, but then she said that FLDS doctors kept upping her dose and upping her dose. Sheesh. And there were days where she thought she would die. She also says...
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, I know. So awful. And then she says that since she did get out, other ex-FLDS members who also managed to get away from the cult told her that while she was in the cult, Warren had put a hit on her to kill her. Which sounds weird because she's the one that's come forward to say about all these accidents, right? So if what she says is true, maybe they didn't need to put a hit on her. But she does say that the FLDS doctrine is such that they believe you can't shed innocent blood. So they need to have a reason to kill you.
Right.
And those reasons are things like dating someone if you're married and, you know, or talking to somebody, adultery, all those things we talked about earlier. But apparently she says she did none of those things. So they just didn't have a reason to kill her. But maybe these hits were not just on her. They were what was happening to all of these mysterious deaths inside the cult.
I wondered if that was the case. Yeah. He's stacking them up and then he's getting rid of them.
Yep. So
because he can't control them all.
No, and she tried quite a few times to escape, but they would always catch her. And in 2013, she was actually sent to live with an older brother. And I'm sure there were a lot of related kids because of the polygamy. But anyway, when she was sent to this older brother, he locked her in a bedroom and wouldn't let her out for 2 weeks. And when he did let her out, she managed to find scissors and hide them in her weird pastel dress. And she managed to unscrew the window frame in the room where she was locked. And she got out. And she ran. And finally, she managed to get into a safe house where she was eventually relocated to Tennessee, where she changed her name. And this is weird. She was legally adopted by another woman. And I don't really know why, but I guess maybe so they couldn't trace her. But then in 2017, Brielle returned to the FLDS compound in Utah, which was called the Dream Center. And that's where she actually had lived with Warren. And that was seized by authorities after his arrest in 2006. And amazingly, she has turned this Dream Center, which was, you know, the home of so much dodgy, horrible things. She's turned it into a refuge for other women who are fleeing cults. So it's kind of amazing. And
I hope they gave it a good cleanse beforehand with their chakra cleansers.
Oh, man, I just think a bit of Dettol and a lot of water and some scrubbing too, because it just sounds horrific what went on there. But she's also found love. Yeah. She's got a new husband. And I tried to find any information about her claims that, that he was murdering people and staging them of accidents, but there's nothing. So if that was true, we'll never know.
It's covered up.
So there it is. Mysterious deaths led me to horrific cult.
That's horrific. Well, like I said, I had been told about this Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey documentary, which is currently on Netflix. I can tell you right now, Michelle, I won't be watching it.
No, I don't want to watch it.
Awful. And I don't want my mind to be sullied in that way. I know it's, you can't pretend these things don't exist. I know they exist. I hear these things on the news all the time. I just don't want to confront it right now. I don't want to see that guy.
No, and that's the thing, that this cult, there is a lot of grim, horrible things that happen to innocent children. And I didn't really want to touch too much on that. Yeah, it's grim. So I would say watch that documentary
with care.
At your own risk.
Yes.
With care.
Wow.
Yeah. So there you go. Sorry. I just have to say sorry because it wasn't a nice jaunty.
You should apologise for the crimes of Warren Jeffs.
No, God. No one. I mean, that guy, he's not getting salvation. I don't care how many wives he married. He's not getting any salvation. That guy's not a good person.
So dark and depraved. I just don't get it. But, this is the world we live in, Michelle, sadly.
Along with aliens taking children.
And aliens kidnapping and coming down. What happened to the aliens that come along and help us, who are decommissioning nuclear warheads and whatnot? And
we need more
stopping
of them.
all these awful things from happening, which we heard about in an episode. Yeah, come back, guys. We need you.
We need more of those. So listen, aliens, if you're eavesdropping right now, come and help us. We need you. And also just do some things with the climate change. We need some help. So, and fix Russia and Ukraine as well.
Turn it down a notch. Fix it for us. And we promise we'll be good from now on. And in the meantime, you know what you've got to do, eavesdroppers. That is, whatever you do,
wherever you are,
just keep
eavesdropping.
Eavesdropping. Eavesdropping. Dropping. Eavesdropping. Dropping. Eavesdropping. Eavesdropping.
dropping.